All right, let's get right into it. For 500 years, there's been this one short, kind of notorious book that's been like a secret manual for kings, dictators, you name it. It's been called pure evil, it's been burned in public squares, and it's been blamed for centuries of tyranny. We're talking, of course, about The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli. But was he really a teacher of evil, or was he something else entirely?
I mean, just listen to that. That is the line straight from his book. It's brutal, it's cynical, and man, it just cuts right to the bone of human nature, doesn't it?
So who would say something like that? A tyrant? Maybe a crime boss? Nope. The man who wrote these words was a civil servant, a bureaucrat, basically, working by candlelight in Renaissance Florence. His name was Niccolò Machiavelli, and his life story, well, that's the key to unlocking this whole infamous book.
What's so wild is that Machiavelli didn't just dream up these rules in some quiet study. He learned them on the ground, in the middle of the absolute chaos of 15th century Italy. You gotta understand, this wasn't a unified country. It was more like a violent chessboard of warring city-states. You had Florence, Milan, Venice, and each one had its own army, its own banks, and its own brand of backstabbing politics. Machiavelli saw his place in all this perfectly. In the dedication of his book, he used this brilliant metaphor. He said, look, just like a painter goes down to the plains to really see the mountains, I'm down here on the plains of society. I'm not a prince. And from down here, I can see the dirty mechanics of power, the bloody gears turning on the mountaintop, way more clearly than the people who are actually up there.
So how do you get this unique perspective? Well, for 14 years, Machiavelli was a top diplomat for the Florentine Republic. Imagine his desk just flooded with spy reports, diplomatic codes, and generals demanding more money. This wasn't just a job, it was a brutal, real-world MBA in how power actually works. And one of his very first lessons came from this guy, Girolamo Savonarola. He was this incredibly charismatic preacher who took control of Florence with nothing but fiery sermons. Seriously, he had no army, no police force. For 4 whole years, he convinced people to burn their books, their art, their luxuries in these giant bonfires of the vanities. The people, they called him a prophet. But then the Pope in Rome, he got fed up. He sent Florence an ultimatum. Either you shut this guy up or I will excommunicate the entire city and hit you with a crippling economic embargo. And just like that, the merchants of Florence had to choose their faith or their wallets. They chose their wallets. The same exact crowd that had cheered for Savonarola just stood by and watched as he was captured, tortured, and publicly executed. Machiavelli watched him burn. You can imagine that lesson was just seared into his mind, leading to this ice-cold conclusion in his book. Moral authority is totally useless without the force to back it up. Faith, he realized, can't stop a sword. His next big lesson came from mercenaries. See, Florence was a city of rich merchants, and they didn't really like to fight their own wars. So they hired professional soldiers called condottieri. And Machiavelli saw firsthand what a total disaster this was. He watched one mercenary captain, Paolo Vitelli, bring the siege of a rival city right to the brink of victory. And then he just stopped. Why? It's simple. If the war ended, his contract and his paycheck would end too. So from that, Machiavelli learned that hired guns aren't just useless, they're actively dangerous to you.
So, after seeing everything that didn't work, Machiavelli soon came face to face with a man who seemed to have it all figured out. A man who was ruthless, brilliant, and, honestly, terrifyingly effective. His name was Cesare Borgia.
So Borgia had just conquered a new territory, and it was filled with people who hated his guts. So what does he do? This is just genius in a horrifying way. He puts this notoriously cruel man, Ramiro di Orco, in charge and tells him to crush all dissent. Soon, the people despise Ramiro, but the region is under control. And that's when Borgia makes his move. One morning, the townspeople wake up and find Ramiro's body cut in 2 in the public square. Borgia had executed his own guy. The message was crystal clear. I've saved you from this monster, but look what I'm capable of. The people were both satisfied and completely terrified.
Machiavelli said a prince has to be 2 animals at once. The lion, to scare off the wolves, and the fox, to recognize the traps. Borgia was both. When his own mercenary captains plotted against him, he didn't attack them head-on. Like a fox, he lured them into a trap. He invited them to a friendly dinner to reconcile, and when they showed up, all unarmed and relaxed, he had every single one of them strangled.
Borgia seemed absolutely unstoppable. But Machiavelli, ever the observer, spotted his one fatal flaw. Borgia's power wasn't actually his own.
The money came from his father, who happened to be the Pope, and the soldiers came from his ally, the King of France. When his father suddenly died, his entire foundation just crumbled overnight. His enemies pounced, and just like that, the most feared man in Italy was finished. The lesson? Never, ever build your house on someone else's land.
And just as Borgia's world collapsed, so did Machiavelli's. In 1512, a Spanish army invaded. The Florentine Republic that he had served fell, and the powerful Medici family, his old political enemies, came roaring back into power.
The new regime moved fast. After 14 years of loyal service, Machiavelli was fired. A few months later, his name was found on some list connected to a failed plot against the Medici. He was arrested, thrown in prison, and subjected to this horrific torture known as the strappado, where his arms were tied behind his back and he was repeatedly hoisted into the air and just dropped, dislocating his shoulders again and again. He went from the heights of power to a dark dungeon, where he learned his final bitter lesson. Justice doesn't protect the innocent. Justice is just a favor granted by the powerful.
So he's released from prison but exiled to his small family farm. Machiavelli was broken, he was jobless, and he was totally disgraced. So what did he do? Every evening he would put on his old formal court clothes, sit down at his desk, and write. He wasn't writing about how the world should be, he was writing about how it is.
And we need to clear something up right now. People always say Machiavelli wrote, "The end justifies the means." He never wrote that. What he actually wrote was "Si guarda al fine," which translates to "one looks to the result." It's a subtle but huge difference. This isn't a moral prescription, it's a cold observation. He's saying people don't care about your noble intentions. They judge you on the outcome. If you win, your methods will be called honorable. If you lose, they'll be called crimes.
And this brings us to his most famous question, the one everyone knows. Is it better for a leader to be feared or to be loved? It's a question every leader has had to ask, and Machiavelli had a very, very clear answer.
Machiavelli's logic here is just ice cold. He says ideally you should be both, but that's pretty much impossible. So if you have to choose, choose fear. Why? Because love is a bond of obligation, which he says men, being kind of selfish, will break whenever it suits them. But fear is held by a dread of punishment, and that never fails. But, and this is the part everyone forgets, he adds a crucial limit. A ruler can be feared but must never be hated. Fear creates obedience, hatred creates rebellion. And what's the fastest way to get people to hate you? Take their property. Which brings us right back to that quote from the very beginning.
So, is that it? Is Machiavelli just a cynical teacher for tyrants? Well, the story is a lot more complicated than that.
You see, what most people don't know is that Machiavelli wrote another, much longer book called Discourses on Livy. And in that book, he kind of drops the mask. He reveals that he was a passionate Republican. He truly believed the best form of government was one where citizens participate. So why write The Prince? He saw autocratic rule as a necessary, short-term medicine. A strong, ruthless leader was needed to forge a state out of chaos. But for long-term health and stability, he thought only a republic would do.
Ultimately, all of this brutal analysis was driven by one thing. He was a desperate patriot. He looked at Italy, fractured, weak, and dominated by foreign barbarians, and he was willing to prescribe any medicine, no matter how bitter, to make it strong and unified. He was basically saying, if you have to, send your own soul to hell to save your country.
So in the end, we're left with this question. The Prince has been a guide for the ruthless for centuries, no doubt about it. But perhaps Machiavelli's real crime wasn't that he taught evil, but that he was the first to describe power without any moralizing fluff. He just held up a mirror to the world. And maybe the reason we're so angry at him, even 500 years later, is because we're terrified of the reflection we see.